Hello, this is Michael from Packrat Productions, and on today's video, I will be talking about the functions of a professional camera. Now, this will be the first of 4 videos I will be producing, and the reason for this is because I will be using various types of cameras and talk about how to use each and every one of these cameras. Now, it's quite a bit of information, so I figured it would be best to talk about this as a series rather than one long video. The other reason why I'm doing this is because, as I said, I'm using different cameras, and there are a lot of factors to consider when you're using various cameras to make a video. There's color temperature, dynamic range, and even frame rate in this case. So to sort of get a clean edit throughout this production, and to sort of stay on track on what I'm covering, I think it would be better to shoot each video with its own camera, and then talk about only that camera for that video. And that is what I'll be covering throughout the time of this series. And with that being said, let us get started. In this video, I used the Canon Vexia HFG30 camcorder. It has full manual control and can record up to 1080p at 60 fps at either MPEG-4 or AVC HD formats. Now, if you have a camera with full manual control like this one, you will have 3 ways of controlling the exposure, which is what I'll be talking about in this first segment of the video. The first 2 exposure types I want to talk about is the f-stops and the gain, and how both can have an effect on the overall quality of the video. Now, in terms of which is the best to use, that would be the f-stops. And that is because the f-stops function is also known as the camera's iris. When you adjust the f-stops, you change the diameter of your iris, which physically controls the amount of light traveling into the camera's DTC sensor. The iris is made up of several overlapping blades that shape and resize in the camera's aperture. When you think about it, the function is very similar to how the human eye works. Now, because this is a mechanical way of controlling the iris, it has very limited effect on the overall quality of the video, unlike the gain, which is actually known as a digital exposure. The gain, or otherwise as known as ISO on a DSLR, alters the exposure by changing the power levels of the pixels on the DTC sensor. With some cameras, you will also notice the gain is also known as dB, which is just an acronym for decibels, a formula most often used to measure sound intensity and power levels within electronic signals. In one of these shots, you may have noticed the gain is set to 23 dB, which means I have amplified the power of the pixels to 23 decibels. What this basically means is it is not allowing more light to come through the camera's aperture, it is artificially adding light to the image. And the downfall to this is you get more noticeable noise in several parts of your shot. Now, for some cameras, there is a safe zone where you can change the gain and it won't have a serious effect on your overall image. For DSLRs, if you stay under 400 ISO, you won't have too much noise in your shot, though the best way to adjust your exposure is by changing the diameter of your iris. Now, there are some things you should be aware of when you're playing with your iris. Like, what does f-stops mean? How does it relate to the size of the iris? Well, truthfully, it doesn't. The f-stops is actually the measurement of the focal length of the camera. When you change the size of your iris, you're also changing the focal depth of the camera's field of vision. And what that basically means is that you're either increasing or reducing what is able to remain in focus. If your iris is nearly closed, your focal length can cover a great deal of depth in the shot. And if your iris is completely open, you will have a very narrow depth of field to cover. Take a look at shot 1 for instance, where it is set to 8 f-stops. You will notice the glass and everything else in the background is in focus. While in shot 2, which is set to 1.8 f-stops, only the glass is in focus in the overall shot. This is just something to consider when you're adjusting the diameter of your iris. Now, there is a third exposure to consider, and that is the shutter speed. Shutter speed is a term commonly used in photography, but it does have some significant applications in videography, and in production for that matter. Basically, shutter speed is the length of time the shutter remains open to allow light to travel into the camera sensor. The timing a shutter is open is usually measured in the fraction of a second. You will see the shutter speed is set to 100, meaning the shutter is open for 1/100th of a second. And of course, the longer the shutter is open, the more time you allow your camera to capture more light. Now, this is another good way to adjust the exposure on your camera. There are a few things that can happen when you change the shutter speed on your camera. Now, it's pretty clear that a video camera is a lot like a photographic camera. The difference with video, however, is it's just being presented to us at such a high speed that it gives us the illusion of a moving image. And anyone who's familiar with photography will know that keeping the shutter open for too long can create an effect known as motion blur. Now, I'm not going to talk about what happens when you keep the shutter open for too long, because we all know what happens when you do that. You create too much motion blur, and then the image looks very amateur. No, what I want to talk about is what happens if it's not open long enough. In this scene, if you look at shot 3 where the shutter speed is set to 1,000th of a second, the last few droplets of orange juice look choppy, And that is because the shutter speed is not open long enough to create that motion blur that we're all familiar with when we look at a moving object. But if you look at shot 1 or even 2, you'll notice the droplets have a bit more of motion blur and the image seems a bit more natural to look at. And that's because when you have that motion blur, it creates that illusion that you're watching this through your eyes rather than through some artificial lens. It is something to keep in mind when you're making a short film or video series. You want to keep your viewer's attention on the story by maintaining that illusion. If you lose that sense of motion, your viewer will lose interest in your film because that illusion is then lost. This is just something to keep in mind when you're playing with the shutter speed on your digital camera. And that is the 3 ways you can adjust your exposure on your full manual camera. And now the next thing I want to talk about is dynamic range. Dynamic range is the differences between the darkest and brightest tones in the image. The best way to describe it is it shows how much a camera can reduce the brightest part of an image before the darkest part falls into complete shadow. Dynamic range, sadly, is something that cannot be adjusted within the camera settings. It is something that varies depending on the make and model of the camera. Now the camera I'm using does have a relatively high dynamic range. Although, according to some online reviews, the best and most affordable camera is the Nikon D850. Really though? If you're finding parts of your image are falling into complete shadow, you may want to adopt a key lighting system to fix the problem. Speaking of lighting systems, this brings us to the last part of this video, where I want to talk a little bit about lighting, specifically LED lighting. So you may have noticed the desk lamp is doing something rather odd in these shots. Now I just want to let you know there's nothing wrong with the camera or the light. This is just a phenomenon that can occur when you're working with LED lights. Before I explain why this is happening, let me tell you to the best of my knowledge how LED lighting works. Those who may be an electrician or have had some education or experience with electronic devices will know that some devices run on either AC or DC power. DC power is known as direct current. What that basically means is that an electronic device is running on a steady electrical current. But with AV power, however, which is known as an alternating current, is an electronic device that is running on a fluctuating current while it's in operation. The rate of this fluctuation depends on the power output of the device. Now this alternating current is too fast for us to pick up with the naked eye, but the reason we are picking it up on this camera is because the light's alternating current and the camera's shutter speed are out of sync with each other. Now this shouldn't be too much of an issue now. LED bulbs have come a long way since they were first manufactured. I actually had to dig this bulb and the lamp out to give this demonstration. I did notice that this effect is more apparent with the LED lights on my speaker system's control panel, so I decided to shoot that as well. I wanted to mention this because this is a problem that can occur when you're shooting on location and you have several different light sources. Odds are one of these lights are operating on an AC current and can do this to your shot. Now all I had to do to improve this is adjust the shutter speed on my camera to try to match the current of these LED lights. I actually had a very similar experience where I and a colleague of mine were having this issue and we couldn't figure out why. But now looking back, I can tell you exactly what happened. Firstly, we didn't know enough about cameras and LED lights and how they work to solve the problem. Second, we were actually using a camera that didn't have the option to change the shutter speed. If we had, we would have solved the problem in less than 10 seconds. I will talk more about cameras with limited functionality in my next video. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I do hope everything I talked about today was informative and will help you in your next independent production. And above all, I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks for watching.